Hello, this is the first of many videos I plan on doing concerning the Second World War. This is meant to act as a resource for both students and just for those interested in the topic. But before we can discuss the events of World War II proper, it's important to address historiography. That is to say, how do we approach the available scholarship surrounding the war? How do we deal with our preconceived notions and cultural attitudes about World War II? And of course, how does the cultural memory of World War II correspond to the historical events therein? Now, when we approach this cultural memory of World War II in the West, particularly in the United States, we are presented with a fairly conventional narrative, whereby you have a black and white painting of good versus bad. The Allies were good, Axis were bad, with the Americans being the peak of ideological purity and idealism. The evil of fascism was rooted out and obliterated by the United States, who were selfless heroes on the world stage. The United States, of course, in this model is fundamentally a force for good, and the Axis is fundamentally evil. American media has furthered this immensely. Historian Stephen Ambrose wrote a series of books, one of the most famous being Band of Brothers, and of course, the popularity of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan has cemented this notion in the public eye. Now, there are some issues with this, mostly that it is not very nuanced, and it provides an oversimplification of what is really a very complicated series of battles and ideological conflicts. That was World War II. And one of the first and most foremost issues here is the American tendency towards isolationism. When you take the pressure of the Great Depression and the 1930, the people in the 1930s had this memory of World War One as a horrific European war that we got sucked into. So right off the bat, the American people largely are not interested in stopping Hitler, Mussolini, or the Japanese junta immediately. There is no immediate want for this. Not only that, but heroism abroad is often used as a shield for covering up for domestic failures. Adolf Hitler himself pointed out that Americans speaking out against his authoritarian rule was fairly stupid because we had Jim Crow laws suppressing the lives, livelihoods, and rights of African Americans at home. Human rights failures of the USSR is another really big issue in the side of historiography, mostly because they were our ally in the conflict. The USSR was notoriously corrupt. It was hopelessly totalitarian. Numerous human rights abuses, such as Stalin's ruthless oppression of the kulaks in Ukraine, and yet they were our ally. So it's hard to paint us as perfectly good when we are aligned with forces such as this. Now, it needs to be said, too, that rather than the United States having this grand goal of just stopping evil and saving the world, it's important to know that the goals actually shifted over time. It started out with just sending, for example, the Lend-Lease Act, just lending resources and weaponry to Great Britain to help them survive, and it slowly morphed to us actually totally dismantling the Third Reich. So it's important to understand that the war goals for all parties shifted over time. It needs to be understood as well that this whole narrative that is the conventional narrative is really just a PR stunt. It's image reconstruction following what was the foreign policy disaster of Vietnam. The United States had been hopelessly embarrassed on the world stage, and it had seemed to have lost its way as a fundamentally moral force. So, looking back on World War II in this fairly revisionist fashion helps rebuild the image of the United States. It also needs to be understood that there was an enormous loss of civilian life. Easily the highest casualty count of World War II was the civilian cost. And the Allies, including the United States, explicitly targeted civilian sites, such as the firebombing at Dresden and the nuclear warheads sent at Hiroshima in Japan. These were horrific events, and regardless of whether you think they were necessary or not, which will be discussed later, it's important to understand that these are extremely controversial, and they definitely hang over all historians who are still asking ethical questions about them to this day. And of course, there are some further issues that I would like to dive into before ending. And one of these is just the issue of patriotism itself. There's nothing wrong with having a patriotic view of your country in a war story. The issue here, however, is that patriotism narratives often merged into a form of chauvinism. This idea that the United States single-handedly whooped the Axis is just not true. It tends to deny Allies' significance, such as the USSR. It needs to be understood that the Soviets had been fighting for years before the United States entered the war, almost to the brink of collapse. And it needs to be understood, too, that the Americans had faults just like everyone else. We also committed war crimes, and some would say not as heinous as the Third Reich, but that seems to be beside the point. It also should be said that the success of this notion of the conventional narrative in a post-Soviet Union collapse world, because mind you, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and this neoconservative order erupted in the United States and abroad. This idea that you have, social and economic conservatism and American idealism, where the United States is propped up as the hero and policeman of the world. George W. Bush, for example, would be an example of a neoconservative. This neocon order essentially ensured that future conflicts, such as the Gulf War or the war against Saddam Hussein, can be likened to World War II. And if we were just in World War II, we were likely just in the Gulf War as well, if we are fundamentally a force for good. Now, this Western perception of the war warped by obsession with Adolf Hitler. What I mean here is that Adolf Hitler is absolutely all over Western television, media, and scholarship. We seem to have this weird obsession with one particular person and facet of World War II, and because of this hinders both scholarship and the public awareness about the war in the West. So some would say that this is an issue with baby boomer documentaries, how back in the day, in the 2000s, you had nothing but Hitler documentaries, to the point where Americans had a relatively skewed idea of what World War II was. This is still relevant, and many people are still affected by this today. It should be said, too, of course, as I said earlier, that numerous ethical problems affect our historiography. Soviet imperialism and brutality is one of the biggest. Mind you, these people were one of our big allies in World War II. And while true, our alliance with them was tenuous and very strained, we were allies with them nonetheless. We were allies with severe war criminals. Now, when we see World War II as a success, it's important to understand that we're just talking about defeating Hitler, the Japanese, and the Italians. Really, in terms of the global stage, World War II actually did not resolve super peacefully. It actually spawned another conflict itself, known as the Cold War, a nearly 45-year struggle for global hegemony between the Soviet Union and the United States, which itself spawned countless wars and conflicts, and many, many, many millions of displacements and deaths across the globe. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about our goal, the American goal of ending World War II on a good note and defeating the evil of fascism, it should be noted that the Allies actually failed spectacularly to both stop the Soviet Union and to stop a global Cold War with the Soviet Union. And as a final note, it's important to understand the war's meaning to the participants involved. On the right, we can see multiple highly, highly racist invectives labeled against the Japanese from the Americans. And in the bottom, we see Germans practicing an outdated pseudoscience called race science on a man checking his nose, likely to check for a level of Jewry. Now, the war's meaning to the participants refers to the fact that to many of the parties involved in World War II, they were not all motivated by the same things. And that's why it's very hard to pin down a singular cause of World War II. First, we have ideological warfare, this idea where you have Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and their militant nationalist fascism going to war against the international Jewish conspiracy that was the liberal order. This idea that the Treaty of Versailles had essentially neutered Germany and humiliated them, and the Germans saw a better way for their country and for the world to be ran. So on one stage, you could say this was an ideological war, a war between the liberal order, represented by the West, and fascism. On the other side of things, it's important to understand that World War II can be seen as a war of the races. This is because in the 18 and 1900s, we were operating under social Darwinism. The idea that some races are inherently more sophisticated and sometimes just better than others. Some races need to be civilized. This is known as the white man's burden. This idea that white men have this God-given right to both dominate and to bring civilization, quote unquote, to other nations. This idea that some races are not only inferior, but are in fact a nuisance, a disgusting pest that should be destroyed. This was certainly the Nazi perspective on Jewry, who they saw as being those who pull the strings behind both the liberal order and communism, both of which the Nazis hated. The Japanese, for example, wished to form a co-prosperity sphere where all the Westerners were kicked out of Asia, and they could form a single monetary and military bloc based upon Asian supremacy, but mostly at its cornerstone, Japanese supremacy. We can also see it as a war of resources. It should be understood that one of Hitler's motivations against destroying the Soviet Union and killing off the Slavic peoples was because he needed what he called Lebensraum, or living space. He wished to displace the people and use their agricultural and domestic outputs for the German people. So you could say that this is a war of resources. The Japanese desperately were, they were a newly industrialized nation. They needed oil. They needed rubber. They did not have that because Japan is very scarce in terms of its natural resources. But the Dutch East Indies, for example, could give the Japanese the rubber they needed. So as we can see, there are very many facets to the quote-unquote cause of World War II. And it should be noted that the motivations evolved over time for all parties involved. And the next video that will be posted will be covering the beginnings of World War II and the historical backdrop to it.